there's a list of do's and there's a list of don'ts. And the do's, I think we could summarize as things that are getting ready for a future business that's not yet in operation.
So this is Amber Lesher. She is one of our CRES JD students.
Hi, Amber. How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. And thanks very much for having me.
What are the various ways in which your old employer can restrict what you do even after you leave?
It's a great question, Liz, and the answer really depends on what state you're in. In some states, employees can be bound by non-competition covenants, which are agreements that essentially say thou shalt not compete with your former employer for 1 year, 2 years, whatever the duration may be. There are also other clauses that say things like, for a year after you leave, you can't solicit your former coworkers to come and join you. You can't encourage them to leave. You can't solicit the customers. There's also intellectual property restrictions. You can't use trade secrets from your former job. You can't invent something while you're still employed and sort of take that invention away with you and use it somewhere else. But that varies from state to state. In states like California, there are no restrictions on competition. There are no restrictions on soliciting coworkers and soliciting customers. So there's a real range of restrictions that are possible around the country, and there's kind of an active debate, both among courts and scholars and practitioners on what the right balance should be.
I guess outside of California, though, there's a lot of stuff that you can't do after you leave if you have one of those covenants.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, for people who are bound by non-competition agreements, so let's assume that you've quit your job already and you're waiting for your non-competition agreement to time out. Interestingly, in those states, you are allowed to make preparations to compete.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the preparing to compete doctrine is?
Yeah, and it turns out that the law is actually pretty uniform around the country, with the exception of Kentucky, which seems to ban all preparations for your next job. But let's leave Kentucky aside. In most other jurisdictions, you're allowed to do a pretty wide number of things. You can speak to an attorney to get advice. You can incorporate your company. You can name your new company. You can even do things like rent space or line up telephone lines, get furniture for the office, have a sign made if you're a small business and you're going to hang the sign outside. So things that are all in the nature of future facing and preparatory. But of course, there's also a list of things that you can't do, most of which are pretty unsurprising. You can't recruit your coworkers while you're still there. You can't recruit customers of the current employer to come with you. And unsurprisingly, you can't misuse intellectual property or violate invention assignment agreements. So there's a list of do's and there's a list of don'ts. And the do's, I think we could summarize as things that are getting ready for a future business that's not yet in operation.
Well, you mentioned that employees can't leave together. Can they never leave together, or are there certain restrictions on that?
There are plenty of cases where employees do leave together and where it's perfectly okay to do so. And we can understand how that can happen if the business is not doing well. Let's imagine someone is being harassed or there's an unpleasant supervisor. You can imagine how a group of employees would get together after work and start organically planning to leave without anybody sort of intending that that was what was going to happen, but the discussions just percolate and people leave together. So we can all see how that would happen. However, for someone to go out and start soliciting coworkers while they're still on the payroll, sort of actively recruiting beyond that circle of original planners, that's where people tend to get in trouble.
I gotcha. So you can't recruit and take them with you.
Yeah, the law seems to allow people to maybe organically have their plans come together in sort of a natural way, but sort of reaching out past that to start soliciting coworkers while still on the payroll is where a lot of people do get in trouble.
Anything else?
I don't think I have anything else.
Amber's in the Witness Protection Program. This is such a sensitive subject. She has to be anonymized.